Hello everyone, Back Photography here with another video, and today I would like to look at the differences between DSLR and mirrorless cameras and whether you would want to be looking at buying a digital SLR camera or a mirrorless camera these days for photography in particular. We're going to be looking at two different cameras today, my Sony a7R IV mirrorless camera, which you might consider to be a flagship camera from Sony, and then we're going to compare that to the Canon 5D Mark IV, which is another flagship system from Canon in the DSLR world. And you might argue that the 1DX Mark III was the new flagship camera from Canon, but that is a more comparable camera to the A9 series with Sony, so I think that the a7R IV versus the 5D Mark IV is a good comparison between DSLR and mirrorless cameras. So here we are in the first location, and I was shooting on an 85mm lens in the photos that I'm going to show you in a minute. I tried to keep the comparison between these photos as fair as possible, so I shot at the same aperture for both the photos, the same ISO, and then if the lighting conditions changed, I tried to keep the shutter speed as similar as possible while maintaining the same exposure. So most of the settings are going to be identical, and the ones that matter and change the quality of the image are going to stay exactly the same. Here are the two photos that we're going to compare side by side, and I tried to get the perspective as close as I could so that you could get the best comparison possible. So before I tell you which one came from the Canon and which one came from the Sony, just take a second to guess which one you think is which. So as you can see, on the left is the Canon photo and on the right is the Sony photo. And the Canon is 15% size right now, and the Sony image is about 10% of the original size. Here are the two photos taken in RAW format, and you can see that the mirrorless camera here performs much better in terms of color depth and also the correct color balance of the image. But the real differences are going to be seen when we zoom into these photos, because the mirrorless camera has a much higher megapixel count than the DSLR camera. This isn't always going to be the case, this is just for this particular comparison. If you were shooting on an A7 III, for example, you would actually have about the same megapixels as the 5D Mark IV. One massive difference that you'll find though when using a mirrorless camera compared to a DSLR is that the mirrorless camera will probably have much better autofocusing capability, and the A7 series for Sony have iFocus, which I find to be super useful compared to my DSLR camera. And I actually find that when I'm shooting on my DSLR at any focal length beyond about 50mm at a low aperture of f2 or below, it's very difficult to get tack sharp images where the eye is perfectly in focus. But on my Sony camera, this is all taken care for you using that eye AF that comes in the camera. And you can see in this example just how Canon very slightly missed focus on Emily's eyes here. But in the mirrorless camera, we got perfect focus. So I've told you a few reasons why you might want to use a mirrorless camera instead of a DSLR, but now let's rapid fire off some reasons why DSLRs might still be the choice for you. First of all, with these two cameras, the DSLR has a bigger LCD screen. It also has a higher resolution screen, so it's easier to see what you're doing on that screen. The battery life is better, it has 900 shots instead of about 670 shots for the Sony. The sensor pixel area is also almost twice as big, so you have twice as big pixels compared to the Sony mirrorless camera. And finally, DSLR cameras do just kind of look the part to the layman who might not know anything about cameras. I don't think this matters too much, but it might matter to you to have something that is big and beefy and looks the part when you're on your photo shoots. And at the end of the day, your photo quality is what's going to determine whether or not people see you as a professional. So just make sure that you take great photos, and it doesn't really matter what your equipment looks like. And if you really care about making your camera look more legit, more professional, you can always add a battery grip to the bottom that kind of increases the size. But one of the benefits of having a mirrorless camera is its size. It's much smaller, more compact, lighter weight normally, and also the lenses tend to be lighter as well. And that's another huge pro of mirrorless cameras, is that you can normally adapt other camera lenses from different systems onto the camera. So for the Sony A series, for example, you can adapt Canon lenses, and I think Nikon lenses as well these days too. And on the Canon mirrorless camera setup, you can use all of the Canon DSLR lenses with an adapter. And that isn't true for DSLR cameras. You cannot adapt lenses for mirrorless systems and other systems like that as easily onto DSLR cameras. So if you want a lot of flexibility with the lens choice, a mirrorless camera might be the one for you. If you're enjoying this content so far and finding it interesting or useful, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. It really helps me a lot in the YouTube algorithm, so thank you very much for subscribing. Another thing I really like about mirrorless cameras is I don't have to shoot through the viewfinder to see what I'm taking a photo of. And yes, DSLR cameras do have a live view mode often where you can take photos, but the autofocus is going to suffer when you're using this mode. But on mirrorless cameras, because they don't have a mirror, this is not a problem. And the viewfinder on mirrorless cameras is actually just another digital screen, so it actually doesn't matter whether you shoot through the viewfinder or through looking at the LCD screen when shooting on mirrorless. And that means that I don't have to contort my body into annoying, awkward angles when I'm trying to get the perfect composition with a mirrorless camera. I can put my camera in any position and just look at the screen, and that means I have way more flexibility with what angles I can take my photos. Here we are again with two photos, both taken on the Sigma 85mm f1.4 art lens, both taken at the lowest aperture of f1.4 with a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second and an ISO of 200. So every setting is the same. These are the JPEG versions of this image, and they're both completely unedited. The only change to the raw file would be in the cameras themselves. We can see that the color balance of both these photos is very, very similar, and that's something we can expect on a bright day when we're shooting with the sun facing towards Emily here. We can see that the color is very, very similar, and the red dress might be a little bit more red on the left photo, which is the photo taken with the Canon camera. But apart from that, these photos are very, very similar. We can also see that the focus breathing on the right image is a little bit more compressed than on the left. You can see that the background looks a little bit more close on the right photo with the Sony compared to the Canon. But I think with these two photos, the Canon wins this photo for the colors and overall look of the image. But let me know in the comments which one you prefer. I'm going to be leaving in the description a link to the raw files from this photo shoot, so you'll be able to see the difference between the Canon and the Sony in a couple of photo examples. And if you're unsure of any of the terminology I just used, I have just released a new portrait photography course which will teach you everything you need to know from absolute beginner all the way to an advanced portrait photographer. It goes through camera settings, what sort of equipment you'll need, advanced editing techniques, composition, lighting, everything you need to know to become a portrait photographer. And right now there is actually a 10% off discount for anyone who purchases this course in the next 28 days. In the past, DSLRs have really been considered the main camera that you would see a professional use for their day-to-day photography, whether it be weddings, portraits, anything really. DSLRs were always the go-to. And it seems like these days that's really started to change, and we're not really seeing manufacturers make DSLR cameras as much as we did 5 or 10 years ago. Everything seems to be moving towards mirrorless. And Sony have definitely been leading the forefront with the mirrorless cameras for a while now, but we're seeing with the Nikon Z series cameras and also the Canon R series cameras that DSLRs are kind of being left to the wayside and are considered to be now old technology compared to the mirrorless technology we're seeing these days. So really, to answer this video, in my opinion, what is better these days? Mirrorless cameras or DSLR cameras? I think personally you can take amazing photos with either setup, but I prefer mirrorless cameras because I think the technology is finally there where the advantages of mirrorless way outperform the advantages of DSLR. The main reasons are the autofocus tends to be much better for portraits, and being a portrait photographer, this is really important for me. Also, the flexibility I have with composition, where I don't have to be looking through the viewfinder to make sure that I'm getting a good composition and good focus. That means that I'm going to have so much more flexibility with where I put my camera, and that's going to make a huge difference for me. Another huge one is the adaptability of the lenses and the lens choices I have when shooting mirrorless. I have all of the lens choice of Sony DSLR cameras, Canon DSLR cameras, Nikon DSLR cameras, and then also my native lenses on my Sony camera. So I have a huge number of lenses, especially ones that I couldn't get on a DSLR camera. One thing that I think is important to stress is that actually both these cameras take very, very similar photos. Yes, the Sony has much more megapixels, but the actual quality of the images is very comparable. So I really don't think that the quality of the image is really a factor for deciding whether to shoot digital SLR camera or mirrorless camera, because they both take such amazing photos. The bottleneck probably isn't going to be the quality of the camera, but rather the skill level of the photographer. And that's definitely true for me when I'm shooting on both cameras. I can definitely get a really good photo on either the SLR or the mirrorless camera. One thing that you might not think would be such a big deal, but is actually really useful, is that the form factor of the Sony makes it much more manageable when you're shooting for long periods of time. So if you're a wedding photographer or someone that tends to shoot all day, this is going to make a big difference, and you're going to really thank yourself for having a lighter camera over the hours and hours of shooting. So which one is better? My opinion is mirrorless, but I'm sure a lot of people think that DSLRs are the better type of camera. So it's completely up to you for you to decide which one is best for you. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you got this far. And remember, there's going to be all the raw files in the description if you would like to pixel peep or have an edit of any of these photos. And I love seeing those when you send them to me on Instagram as well. So thank you very much for sending those to me. And I'll see you in the next video.